The neighborhood of Maplewood Estates had always seemed like the kind of place where nothing dramatic ever happened, a cluster of well-maintained houses with tidy lawns, trimmed hedges, and an HOA that prided itself on rules, regulations, and the illusion of control. But beneath the veneer of suburban peace, tensions had been simmering for years, and at the center of nearly every petty conflict was one woman who had gained a reputation as the self-appointed enforcer of the neighborhood's image. Her name was Karen Whitfield, and while technically just another resident, her constant interference in the lives of her neighbors had made her infamous. She was the type of person who would measure the length of your grass with a ruler, who would file complaints about children's bikes being left in driveways, and who would lecture anyone who dared paint their shutters a shade she hadn't personally approved. To the HOA board, she was both a blessing and a curse, persistent enough to keep rules enforced, but meddlesome enough to alienate nearly every household on her block. The simmering dislike most people had for her boiled into open hostility the day she decided to take matters into her own hands regarding the Henderson family's backyard treehouse. The Hendersons had moved in 3 years earlier, a family of four who instantly became known for their kindness and easygoing personalities. Mark and Emily, the parents, were the type who waved at everyone, invited neighbors to barbecues, and always volunteered for block parties. Their kids, 11-year-old Jake and 9-year-old Sophie, were energetic, creative, and in the eyes of most residents, a breath of fresh air in a neighborhood often suffocated by rigid rules. One of the first things Mark had done when they settled in was build a tree house for the kids in the sturdy old oak tree at the corner of their backyard. It wasn't a massive structure, just a small wooden fort with a rope ladder, some windows, and a platform where Jake and Sophie could play, read, or imagine themselves as adventurers on grand quests. To the kids, it was magical, but to Karen, it was an eyesore. From her second-story window, she had a direct view of the treehouse, and every time she glanced out, it seemed to taunt her with its defiance of HOA guidelines. She had complained to the board multiple times, citing unsightly structures and safety hazards, but the truth was the HOA rules were vague on play structures, and the majority of the board saw no problem with it. After all, the Hendersons had built it safely, and it wasn't visible from the street, only from Karen's meticulously pruned rose garden. Still, Karen would not let it go. To her, rules weren't suggestions, and even when others dismissed her complaints, she saw herself as Maplewood's last line of defense against chaos. Over the months, her bitterness grew. Each time she saw the children laughing and shouting in their little fort, each time their joy carried over the fences and into her carefully curated bubble, it grated on her nerves. She told herself it was about safety, that one of the kids could fall and sue the neighborhood, but deep down it was something else, an uncontrollable need to dominate and impose her will. And so, on a humid Saturday afternoon in late August, while most neighbors were inside enjoying air conditioning, Karen decided to do what she believed the HOA should have done months earlier. Armed with a handsaw and wearing a wide-brimmed sun hat as if she were just tending to her garden, she marched across the shared fence line and into the Hendersons' backyard without permission. She muttered under her breath about irresponsible parenting as she positioned herself at the base of the tree. The Hendersons weren't home at the time. Mark was running errands with Emily, and Sophie was at a sleepover, but Jake, eager to enjoy the last days of summer before school resumed, had climbed up into the treehouse with a comic book and a bag of chips. He was stretched out on the wooden floor when he heard the faint scraping noise below. Curious, he peered down through the trapdoor and was shocked to see his neighbor, Karen, sawing into the very branch that supported part of the structure. At first, he thought it was some kind of sick joke, but the intensity in her expression and the way she worked the saw back and forth told him otherwise. "Hey, stop!" Jake shouted, his voice trembling as the realization hit him that this wasn't just meddling, this was dangerous. Karen looked up, startled but not apologetic. "You shouldn't even be up there. It's unsafe, and your parents should know better," she snapped, as though her intrusion and destruction were justified by some moral authority only she recognized. Panic surged through Jake as the branch gave a small crack, the treehouse shuddering beneath him. He scrambled toward the rope ladder, desperate to get down before her reckless act caused the whole thing to collapse. But he wasn't fast enough. With one final pull, the branch snapped and the treehouse lurched violently to one side. Jake lost his footing, slipping from the ladder and hitting the ground hard, pain shooting through his arm as he landed awkwardly on the grass. Karen froze, saw still in hand, as the boy cried out in agony. In that moment, she realized what she had done, but instead of rushing to help, her instinct was to justify herself. "This wouldn't have happened if your parents had followed the rules," she stammered, her voice shaking more from fear of consequences than from concern for the injured child. Unfortunately for her, the commotion had drawn the attention of several neighbors. The Johnsons from next door rushed out, horrified at what they saw, while another neighbor, already dialing 911, shouted at Karen to drop the saw and step away. The illusion of control she had clung to shattered instantly as reality set in. She hadn't just broken HOA etiquette or pushed the boundaries of neighborly decency, she had caused real harm. Within minutes, sirens echoed through Maplewood Estates, and deputies pulled up to the Hendersons' home, lights flashing. Karen tried to explain, insisting she was only acting in the best interest of the neighborhood, but the sight of Jake clutching his arm in pain while witnesses told officers what had happened made her excuses sound hollow. For the first time, Karen's arrogance had crossed into criminal territory, and the neighborhood that once tolerated her meddling now looked on in disgust as deputies placed her in handcuffs and informed her she was being charged with felony assault. When deputies escorted Karen toward the squad car, the entire street seemed to have spilled out of their homes to watch. It was surreal. Neighbors who had endured her constant interference for years now stood silently, some with arms crossed, others with phones recording, their expressions reflecting both shock and grim satisfaction. For so long, Karen had wielded the HOA like a weapon, filing complaints and demanding compliance for even the smallest infractions, but now she was the one in clear violation of something far more serious than an overgrown lawn or a misplaced trash can. Jake, meanwhile, sat trembling on the grass, his arm twisted awkwardly against his side, tears streaking down his face. The Johnsons knelt beside him, trying to keep him calm until the ambulance arrived. One of the deputies, seeing the boy's condition, radioed for paramedics to expedite their arrival. As Karen was placed into the back of the cruiser, her protests grew louder. "This is absurd. I was protecting the community. That structure was illegal. It was dangerous. Someone had to do something before a child got hurt." Her voice cracked with indignation, as though her mind could not reconcile the irony of her words with the reality of what had just happened. She was the one who had caused the very injury she claimed to prevent. The crowd murmured in disbelief, neighbors shaking their heads at her shamelessness. When the ambulance finally arrived, Jake was carefully lifted onto a stretcher. His face was pale, and his whimpers grew louder with each movement. Emily and Mark pulled up at that very moment, their SUV screeching to a stop as Emily leapt from the passenger seat. The sight of her son in the hands of paramedics caused her to let out a cry that echoed across the street. She rushed forward, demanding to know what had happened, her eyes darting between Jake and the cluster of neighbors until her gaze landed on the squad car. When she saw Karen sitting inside with her arms cuffed behind her, her shock turned into fury. "What did you do?" she screamed, her voice sharp with rage as she tried to push past the deputies to get closer. Mark caught up to her, his face flushed, but he kept a steady hand on her shoulder, urging her to focus on Jake first. Emily's tears spilled as she knelt beside the stretcher, stroking Jake's hair and whispering reassurances. He tried to be brave, but the pain was too much, and his trembling words of "Mom, it hurts," only deepened the heartbreak. Mark clenched his fists, glaring toward the squad car, unable to believe that their neighbor, who had already made their lives miserable with constant complaints, had now escalated to violence against their child. The deputies explained in a measured tone what had happened, how witnesses confirmed Karen had entered their yard without permission and sawed through the branch while Jake was inside the treehouse. Emily's face went pale at the details, the horror of how much worse it could have been sinking in. If the fall had been from just a few feet higher, if Jake had landed differently, the outcome might have been catastrophic. As the ambulance pulled away, Mark and Emily followed in their SUV, leaving the deputies to finish securing the scene. Karen, still ranting in the back of the cruiser, turned her wrath toward the officers now. "You don't understand. That boy could have sued the whole neighborhood if he had fallen from that thing. I was protecting everyone's property values. This is exactly why rules exist." Her voice grew shrill, bordering on hysterical, but the deputies ignored her. They had heard countless excuses in their careers, and this one was as flimsy as the branch she had destroyed. At the station, the reality of her situation finally began to set in. She was booked, fingerprinted, and placed in a holding cell, her protests falling on deaf ears. She demanded to speak to the HOA board, certain that they would vindicate her actions, but when she was told she had been charged with felony assault, trespassing, and destruction of property, her composure cracked. Karen had always thrived on control, but behind the cold steel bars, she was powerless. Meanwhile, word of the incident spread like wildfire through Maplewood Estates. Social media groups for the neighborhood lit up with posts and comments, residents expressing their outrage, their disbelief, and in some cases, their grim satisfaction that the woman who had tormented them for years had finally crossed a line too big to ignore. Stories of her past meddling resurfaced. How she had once threatened to fine a family for putting up Halloween decorations a day too early, how she had tried to ban chalk drawings on sidewalks, how she had berated teenagers for parking too close to her driveway. Each memory painted a picture of a woman whose obsession with rules had poisoned the community spirit. But this time, no one was laughing. Everyone understood that what happened to Jake could have been far worse, and the image of him being carried away in an ambulance struck a nerve. Some residents began organizing to attend the next HOA meeting, not just to demand accountability from Karen, but to push back against the toxic culture that had enabled her behavior for so long. In the hospital, Jake underwent x-rays and treatment for a broken arm and a concussion. The doctors reassured Emily and Mark that with time, their son would heal, but the emotional scars would linger. Jake was shaken, not only by the pain of his injury, but by the betrayal of a neighbor he had once considered merely annoying. He struggled to understand why someone would deliberately destroy something he loved, and his parents were left grappling with how to explain it in a way that didn't terrify him further. For Emily, the anger boiled beneath the surface, her protective instincts ignited by the thought that someone had endangered her child. Mark, though equally furious, tried to focus on practical matters, legal action, insurance claims, and the inevitable court proceedings. Both knew that their peaceful life in Maplewood had been shattered, and nothing would ever feel quite the same again. As night fell on the neighborhood, a quiet unease settled over Maplewood Estates. The treehouse, once a symbol of childhood joy, now lay in splintered pieces at the base of the oak tree, a stark reminder of how quickly innocence could be destroyed by malice and obsession. For Karen, the night was spent alone in a cold cell, the weight of her actions pressing down on her for perhaps the first time in her life. For the Hendersons, the night was spent in the hospital, holding Jake's good hand, reassuring him that he was safe now, even though deep down they knew safety was something that had been stolen from them the moment Karen picked up that saw. And for the rest of the neighborhood, the night was spent in reflection, wondering how they had let things spiral so far, and what they would do when morning came, now that the illusion of Maplewood's perfect harmony had been shattered forever. The days following the incident were unlike anything Maplewood Estates had ever experienced, as if the quiet suburban neighborhood had suddenly been thrust into the center of a scandal that no one could ignore. News vans parked at the entrance of the subdivision, their satellite dishes pointing toward the sky, while reporters stood ready with microphones to deliver the shocking story of a woman who had taken HOA enforcement into her own hands and ended up injuring a child. The headline practically wrote itself: Treehouse attack in Maplewood, neighbor charged after boy hurt, and within hours the incident spread beyond local coverage, sparking debates online about the overreach of homeowners associations, the dangers of obsessive control, and the audacity of a neighbor who would resort to such reckless behavior. For the Hendersons, life became a blur of hospital visits, police interviews and constant phone calls from concerned friends, family, and even strangers who had read about their ordeal. Emily stayed by Jake's side day and night, refusing to leave the hospital until doctors were satisfied that his concussion was stable and his broken arm properly set in a cast. Mark tried to maintain composure, but the endless interviews and paperwork drained him. Each time he retold the events, how their neighbor trespassed, how she destroyed the treehouse, how their son fell, it felt like pouring salt into an open wound. What gnawed at him most was the knowledge that all of this could have been avoided had Karen simply minded her own business, but that was something she had never been capable of doing. Meanwhile, Karen's name became synonymous with everything people loathed about HOAs and controlling neighbors. Social media branded her as HOA Karen, a nickname that spread rapidly and stuck with brutal permanence. Memes circulated of her scowling face juxtaposed with saws and tree houses, turning her into both a cautionary tale and an object of ridicule. To outsiders, she was a punchline, but to those who lived in Maplewood Estates, she was a living reminder of how unchecked interference could destroy a sense of community. Despite the public ridicule, Karen remained unrepentant. From the moment she was released on bail, she attempted to spin the narrative, claiming she was the true victim of an ungrateful neighborhood that refused to follow rules. She gave interviews to any outlet that would listen, insisting that the Hendersons had built the treehouse illegally, that she was acting in the best interest of everyone's safety, and that the charges against her were politically motivated because the sheriff's department didn't want to anger the community. Her lawyer, a weary-looking man who seemed less enthusiastic about her case than she did, cautioned her to stop speaking publicly, but Karen couldn't resist the spotlight. Every word she spoke, however, only seemed to dig her deeper into public condemnation. The HOA board, long complicit in allowing Karen to dominate meetings and bully residents into compliance, suddenly found itself under fire as well. Neighbors who had once been intimidated by her came forward, demanding accountability, insisting that the board distance itself from her actions. At an emergency meeting held in the community clubhouse, dozens of residents gathered, their voices echoing with frustration. Emily, still exhausted from hospital visits, attended alongside Mark, determined to make her voice heard. When she stood to speak, the room fell silent, everyone aware of the gravity her words carried. She recounted the fear on her son's face, the sight of him lying on the ground, the terror of hearing a doctor say the word concussion. Her voice trembled, but her anger was clear. This wasn't just about a treehouse, she told them, her eyes sweeping across the crowd. This was about control, about one person believing she had a right to endanger others because she didn't get her way. And if this board doesn't take responsibility for enabling her behavior all these years, then you're telling every family here that their children aren't safe. The speech was met with thunderous applause, residents clapping not only for her words, but for the courage it took to say them out loud. For years, people had whispered about Karen's overreach, but fear of retaliation had kept them quiet. Now, with the Hendersons' tragedy fresh in their minds, silence was no longer an option. The board members, visibly uncomfortable, promised to review policies and take corrective action, but it was clear their credibility had been shaken beyond repair. In the Henderson household, Jake slowly adjusted to life with a cast and doctor's orders to rest. His days were quieter now, filled with books, video games, and the occasional visit from friends who came bearing cards and small gifts to cheer him up. Yet, the loss of his treehouse weighed heavily on him. Sometimes he would look out the window at the broken remains of the oak tree, his expression distant, as if mourning the loss of a world that had belonged entirely to him. Emily tried to lift his spirits with promises of building something new when he healed, but she could see in his eyes that the innocence of the treehouse could never be replaced. Mark busied himself with preparations for the upcoming trial. The district attorney had assured them the case was strong, bolstered by multiple eyewitnesses and Karen's own ill-advised statements during her arrest. Still, he knew the legal process would be long and draining. Karen's defense team was already hinting at arguments of mental instability or misinterpreted intentions, and while Mark doubted a jury would be sympathetic, he also knew nothing in court was ever guaranteed. At night, when the house grew quiet, he and Emily often sat together in the living room, talking in hushed tones about their fears, their hopes, and the uncertain future. Both knew they would never feel entirely comfortable in Maplewood Estates again, but moving felt impossible for the moment, tied down as they were by legal battles and a community still reeling from the fallout. For Karen, isolation grew heavier with each passing day. Neighbors avoided her, cars slowed when driving past her house, and she became a pariah in the very community she once dominated. Yet, in her mind, she clung to the belief that she had been right. She paced her living room at night, replaying the incident over and over, convincing herself that history would vindicate her, that one day people would thank her for her vigilance. But as she looked out her window, the same one from which she had once glared at the treehouse, all she saw were curtains drawn tight and neighbors refusing to meet her gaze. The trial loomed ahead, and though Karen spoke confidently about her chances, everyone else seemed to know what she refused to admit. Her reign in Maplewood Estates was over, and whatever happened in the courtroom would be less about whether she was guilty and more about how much punishment she would face for finally crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. The trial of Karen Whitfield quickly became the most talked about event in Maplewood Estates history, drawing reporters, curious onlookers, and neighbors who wanted to see justice served. On the morning of the first hearing, the courthouse steps were crowded with cameras as Karen arrived in a conservative blazer and skirt, her hair pinned back tightly as though she wanted to project authority and control even in the face of felony charges. She walked stiffly beside her attorney, ignoring the shouted questions from journalists, asking if she regretted hurting a child. Her only response was a tight-lipped glare that betrayed both her pride and her simmering resentment. Inside the courtroom, the Hendersons sat together in the front row, Mark's arm wrapped protectively around Emily as Jake leaned against his mother, his arm still in a cast. He looked smaller than usual in the large wooden benches, his face pale, but determined. Though Emily had debated whether to bring him, she knew his presence was important, not just to remind the jury of the real victim, but to show Karen that the boy she had endangered was not invisible or expendable. The prosecution wasted no time painting a vivid picture of Karen's actions, trespassing into her neighbor's yard, wielding a saw with intent, and ignoring the pleas of a child who had begged her to stop. Witness after witness recounted the events of that day, from the Johnsons who had seen her sawing the branch, to the neighbor who had called 911, to the deputies who had arrived on scene to find her unrepentant. The prosecution underscored her lack of remorse, playing audio recordings from her arrest where she insisted she was protecting the community. The jury listened intently, their expressions hardening with each piece of evidence. When it was Karen's turn to testify, her lawyer urged her to show humility, but Karen couldn't suppress her nature. She spoke with indignation, railing about HOA rules, about her duty to protect property values, about how she had been unfairly demonized. At one point, she even gestured toward the Hendersons, accusing them of negligence for building the treehouse in the first place. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, and the judge sternly warned her to restrain herself. Instead of winning sympathy, Karen's testimony only reinforced the image of a woman consumed by control and devoid of compassion. In contrast, Emily's testimony was raw and heartfelt. She described the fear she felt rushing home to see her son injured, the endless nights spent in the hospital, and the emotional toll it had taken on her family. She didn't raise her voice or lash out, but the quiet strength in her words carried more weight than any outburst ever could. Mark followed with his own testimony, his voice steady as he spoke of betrayal, of how neighbors should protect each other rather than cause harm. When Jake took the stand briefly, his small voice trembling as he recalled yelling, "Stop," while Karen sawed the branch, the courtroom fell utterly silent. Even the jurors shifted uncomfortably, some visibly moved by the child's courage in reliving his trauma. By the time closing arguments were made, the narrative was clear. This was not about HOA rules, but about reckless endangerment, about an adult who chose to place her own obsession above the safety of a child. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with a verdict. Guilty on all counts. Karen's face went rigid as the words were read, her lips pressed into a thin line as though refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. But when the judge sentenced her to 3 years in prison with additional probation for trespassing and restitution for damages, the facade cracked. She shook her head in disbelief, muttering under her breath that the system was corrupt, that she was a martyr, that one day people would see she had been right. Yet no one in the courtroom seemed to agree. For the Hendersons, the verdict brought a wave of relief mixed with exhaustion. Emily cried quietly, holding Jake close, while Mark exhaled a breath he felt he had been holding for months. Neighbors who had come to support them patted their shoulders, whispering words of comfort and admiration for their courage. Though nothing could undo the trauma, there was solace in knowing that accountability had finally arrived. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. But this time, the focus wasn't on Karen's rants, it was on the Henderson family's resilience. Emily gave a short statement, her voice steady despite her tears. All we ever wanted was to raise our children in peace. No parent should ever have to watch their child suffer because of someone else's obsession with control. Today, justice was served, not just for Jake, but for every family who deserves to feel safe in their own home. The crowd applauded, and the cameras captured the image of a mother's fierce love, a father's steadfast resolve, and a boy whose bravery had brought a community together. In Maplewood Estates, the fallout continued long after the trial ended. The HOA board faced intense pressure to reform, and in the next election, nearly the entire leadership was voted out in favor of residents who promised transparency and compassion over rigid enforcement. New rules were established to ensure no single member could wield undue influence, and community events began to focus more on connection than compliance. It was as if the neighborhood, once strangled by Karen's constant interference, was finally breathing freely again. For the Hendersons, healing was slow but steady. Jake's arm eventually mended, and though he still flinched at loud noises or sudden movements, he began to smile more as the months passed. Mark kept his promise to rebuild something for him. This time not a treehouse, but a small backyard shed that doubled as a clubhouse designed with Jake's input, so he felt ownership of the space. It wasn't the same as the magical fort in the oak tree, but it symbolized resilience, the ability to create joy again even after loss. Emily, though still protective and wary, found comfort in the way neighbors rallied around them, bringing meals, checking in, and offering help. The sense of isolation she had once felt evaporated, replaced by a network of support that reminded her not all neighbors were like Karen. There was goodness in Maplewood, and though the scars of the incident would always remain, they were tempered by the kindness that followed. As for Karen, prison life stripped her of the control she had always clung to. Behind bars, her demands for special treatment went ignored, her complaints about rules met with indifference. She became just another inmate, her reputation as HOA Karen preceding her, earning her ridicule rather than respect. For the first time in her life, she was powerless, and though she continued to tell herself she was misunderstood, the world outside had moved on without her. In the end, Maplewood Estates was changed forever. The story of the treehouse that was destroyed, the boy who was hurt, and the neighbor who went too far became a cautionary tale told in hushed tones to newcomers. Yet it was also a story of resilience, of how a community once divided by pettiness found unity in the face of tragedy. And for Jake, though he would always remember the fear of that day, he would also remember the strength of his family, the support of his neighbors, and the knowledge that justice, though slow, had finally prevailed.